Hi everybody, welcome back to the 8th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. In this episode of Open Source for Business, I talk with Nithya Ruff, who is the chair of the Linux Foundation and also the head of Comcast's Open Source Program Office. Nithya has been listed in the past as one of the most influential women in open source by CIO Magazine. I had a really interesting conversation with Nithya, and she provided some truly invaluable advice for any company that's using, contributing to, or even creating open source software. Some of the topics that we did discuss and that we dove deep into were largely centered around what an open source program office is, why any company would want one, how do you go about setting one up, and then how do you measure the success, so the ROI of having that open source program office. Nithya goes on to explain why an open source friendly approach attracts great talent, and she's very passionate about diversity inclusion within the open source space, so we talk quite a bit about that too. We discuss many other things, and it's a really fun and engaging conversation, so I look forward to you all listening to it. One thing I did want to share with all of you before we get into this is the link to Comcast's GitHub page. I think you'll really find some great stuff there. You can see all of the amazing work they've been doing, and there are some really awesome projects on there. So just again, this is a podcast brought to you by Open Teams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. To show support for this podcast, it would be great if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, letting us know what you think. That really does go a long way, so thank you for all your support so far. All right, I think we're ready, so let's dive right in. Nithya, thank you so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure, Henry. Thank you for inviting me.
I know that you've published a lot of articles. I've seen your name all over social media when it comes to open source, and you give a lot of talks around business and community all around the world at conferences like the OSS Summit, OSCON, All Things Open, Scale, OpenStack, and the list literally goes on. And while you didn't start out necessarily as a coder using open source software, you began your career in open source when you were working at SGI in the 90s. So you go a while back in open source. So could you take us a bit back and give us an idea of how you got here today?
Absolutely, Henry. And it's stunning to me when I look back that it was the beginning days of open source. So I started as you said, in 1998, working at Silicon Graphics, which was a world-class server company who produced post-production software for movies like Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park. And we were in the midst of making a transition from proprietary operating systems to Linux-based servers. We could see the writing on the wall that open source was here to stay and that customers wanted open source based servers on x86 type of architecture, standards based architecture. Customers got the cost effectiveness, the innovation of Linux. And so I was part of a strategy team learning all I could about how open source communities worked and how Silicon Graphics could then work closely with the community and then bridge to our customers and serve our customers using an open source based product. It's a very different model. And so it was so much fun to be in the early days of open source. And I think that began my journey. And I would say the overarching story for me is I'm a connector. I connect communities of open source and companies. So I help companies work more effectively with open source and help open source communities work more effectively with enterprises and companies that are adopting open source so broadly. So if you will, the next step was a natural step. I joined a startup called Tripwire, helped them with their open source strategy and open source their products, which then led me to really leading a whole product line, an embedded Linux product line at Wind River Systems, which was a part of Intel. I got to work with both open source communities like Yocto and other embedded open source communities, and really sell customers on the benefits of a commercial open source distribution that we were providing. So you can see it was yet another aspect of commercial open source. And then I was lucky enough to work at SanDisk Western Digital, which is a storage company, flash-based storage. And on the surface, one thinks, what does storage have to do with open source? But there's a tremendous amount of open source innovation that was happening inside SanDisk to make sure that software could optimize and effectively support storage. So I started the first open source program office for SanDisk and reported into the CTO at SanDisk. And that was a tremendous, experience, because I also got to start the Women's Innovation Network at SanDisk, which was our employee resource group there for women in technology. And so I could really take both passions of representing diversity and also starting open innovation for a company like SanDisk, which led me to my current area, which is Comcast. And as you also covered my open source work at the Linux Foundation, and it's just a fantastic place to be. I'm doing the best work of my life and enjoying it.
That is great to hear. And you've obviously got such a broad range of experience, but something that you really focused on too is the open source program offices, which we'll touch soon. But before we get into that, I wanted to know, over the years and over the decades, what have been the most important changes or the most impactful changes that you've witnessed in the open source space?
Very, very good question, because it's important to look back and look at our history and where we have come from. The first phase I always define as the community phase. It's where free and open source software was born. In MIT, with people like Richard Stallman, the Free Software Foundation, the beginning of the GNU GPL license, that kind of said the way business was done in proprietary software is not good enough. We need more collaboration. We need access to source code, and we need to have the freedom really to use it for whatever we want. So that was really the community phase, I would say. It was very organic. A lot of people were involved. The second phase, I would say, is the foundations phase. So you have the beginning of foundations like the Apache Foundation, the Linux Foundation. This was started because companies started using open source, and they wanted a neutral place where they could collaborate with each other and create new software together. You couldn't really do it, say, from an IBM or a Sun or a Silicon Graphics, because it would be biased or it would be driven by one company. And this provided a neutral home. The other objective of these foundations was to protect and defend open source, to propagate open source, to educate people on open source. So the creation of foundations, to me, is significant. The third phase is the beginning of massive hyperscale and cloud companies starting to build their infrastructure on open source. So you see the beginnings of Google using open source, Facebook, Amazon, and you can go on and on. All of these companies were born post open source, and so an infrastructure was rich in the open source arena, and they started building on open source. The fourth phase, frankly, is enterprises like Comcast, Capital One, others starting to use open source themselves and realizing that they could be empowered and they could become software development houses. They could be technology leaders and start innovating on their own in the application space, in the customer UI space where they serve customers. So to me, that's the long history and some of the major events that happened in open source.
That was amazing. And it's great just to see the change. And I think it really is just the businesses actually taking open source more seriously. And that's what's changed, to the extent that every business knows they need to take open source seriously if they want to operate in a modern day corporate environment. So going forward, what are some of the trends that you are seeing happening right now that enterprises should be aware of?
You hit it on the nail, Henry. I think all enterprises need to recognize that they are now technology companies and digital companies, especially during COVID. It has accelerated companies' need to be digital companies, to serve their customers digitally and through technology. What that means is that they're all consuming or using software of some sort, and even working, creating software. And it also means that 80 to 90% of the software they're consuming will include some form of open source. So they need to get educated in open source. They need to understand how to engage with open source, how to work with open source. They need to understand licenses, etc. And then the second major trend I would say for enterprises to pay attention to is that open source is not just for working externally with open source communities. You can bring the power of collaboration inside the company and use it to collaborate inside the company across divisions, across product lines, thereby breaking down silos, reusing software, collaborating with teams across the company, even to create proprietary software. And that movement has been called inner source.
Inner source. Okay. As I was going to ask, that's the inner source movement that you were talking about. Okay. And you briefly touched on best practices or what companies should be doing when they're contributing to open source or engaging with communities. But before I actually dive into more details around that, I really wanted to focus in on what I see as your expertise, and that is open source program officers. You're now the head of Comcast's open source program office, and you started SunDisk's open source program office. So for those listening who are companies and they maybe have one representative or even just a group of people who are interested in open source, for a lot of also those that don't know anything about it, what is an open source program office and why would any company want one?
And that's a great question, because open source program office is a concept that started just in the last 10 years. So essentially, I would say some of the early companies were HP, Google, Intel have had major open source program offices. And it often is large companies that start kind of this type of an office. So what is it, right? It is a center of excellence for all things open source in a company. It means that a company assembles experts in open source in one place, which becomes very efficient for all engineering teams, legal teams, communication teams to work with. Not everybody needs to, become an expert in this. It's a concept that's pretty familiar to very large and traditional companies. For example, for many, many years, companies had standards bodies, so a group of people inside the company who would interface with standards bodies and make sure that they brought back information from the standards bodies and also contributed and influenced the standards body for the benefit of the company. So I call an OSPO as having 6 C's, as in Charlie.
6 C's.
The first C, I would say, is communication, communicating about open source inside and outside the company. The second C is consumption, so helping teams consume wisely and correctly. The third C is contributing back to open source, so really guiding teams to contribute back and also provide a process for approving contributions back to open source. The fourth C would be collaboration, helping teams engage with open source communities, with foundations, with other open source businesses, and really harness the power of collaboration. The fifth C would be compliance, extremely important. One of the small things we need to do when we use open source is comply with the licenses and understand the obligations that come with the licenses. And so we consult and help teams inside Comcast comply with the license. The last C, which is so all-encompassing, is culture. So it's really creating a culture of open source, being a good citizen in open source. It's competency around open source. It's everything. It's really being a friendly and a good citizen in open source. Let's see, what else can I say about an OSPO? It really kind of includes a lot of different functions. We are developer advocates, so we work with our developers and we advocate on their behalf with communications with legal teams. We champion open source engagement. And one of the functions that more and more I'm doing is I'm an innovation strategist. So I consult with the business to see where open source makes sense, whether they should open source something or consume open source or collaborate with others. So I call it a jack of all trades or a Jill of all trades. And the team that I have from an open source perspective really brings together a multifunctional outlook and a huge community frame of mind.
I think, yeah, it always comes back to community. And one thing you touched on before that I'd like to sort of just deviate back to a little bit is the idea of compliance. Primarily because last week we had a few weeks ago, we had a chat with Paul Chen, who works at Synopsys on different auditing, mainly works on auditing. And he was saying there was a client that after doing an audit report found, I think it was over 150,000 open source projects dependencies in their software, which they were just flabbergasted by. So do you have any advice to those listening? How do you make sure that you're being compliant? Do you need a legal team? Do you need just one person who's got that legal background? Do you need a legal background at all?
So the open source program office itself, we are not legal experts. We're not lawyers, but we work extremely closely with our legal team. One of the best relationships we have is with our legal team. Mm-hmm. And we have a fabulous legal team at Comcast, people who really can think broadly, not just about risk mitigation, but can think about the business needs for open source. So I would say one of the first things is get very friendly with your legal team, and also bring your legal team into open source events, open source forums, where they can understand and also work with their peers in open source legal to understand why and how to balance company needs with open source licenses and open source needs. So I would say that's number one. Number two is a lot of education. So we have a mandatory course that every single engineer and product manager needs to take in the company.
Wow, that's great.
It's just 15, 20 minutes. It teaches them the compliance principles and our policy around compliance as a company. Third, you have to have a policy document, a guidelines in the company around open source, how to consume it, how to use it wisely. We highly encourage our teams to innovate using open source, but we also want them to use it correctly. So we provide guidelines and we provide policy documents. The fourth, I would say from a compliance perspective, is build it into your pipeline, into your workflow, into your development pipeline. So it's a no-brainer, right from the intake of open source to nightly builds where you're checking for open source and resolving conflicts or resolving license issues, to creation of disclosure notices and posting of disclosure notices. Automate that and make sure that it's well-oiled and well done. To me, compliance is a respect for open source. It's a respect for the community. And we are very, very encouraging and supportive of our teams doing it well.
That's great, because it is such an important issue. There's been so many famous legal cases where you've realized the money at stake if you're not taking compliance seriously. So for those listening who are interested in what you've said, where can they begin to start an OSPO? Where should a company begin?
So I'll be shuffling some papers because I wanted to make sure you got the best advice from us in terms of how we've done open source. I would say to begin, I would say start with someone in your teams, and not all companies are very large, and not all companies can afford to have a large team of experts doing it. So I would say start with someone in your development team who's an open source enthusiast or an open source expert. There always is one, because a lot of us really, really enjoy working with the open source community and love the philosophy of collaboration. Mm-hmm. So start with that expert, have that expert go take a look at all of the uses of open source in the company and do an audit and kind of an aggregation of all the open source work that's happening in the company. And then go back and talk to legal and see how legal's been involved in open source in the company. And then really compile a recommendation, if you will, to the head of engineering or CTO and say, this is what we're doing in open source. I think we need to have a focus on this, and we need to have someone who can, take this on either part-time or full-time to work on this. Developers often listen better to developers. So that's why I always say it's best to have it in engineering in the CTO office. And that's where I am. I sit in the CTO office in Comcast and in one of the largest engineering organizations within Comcast. And we think of our developers as our customers. So we are all about making them heroes and successful in whatever they do. So if you can go with that mindset, do an aggregation of what's happening and start small. I would also say attend an open source event, whether it's Open Source Summit. Sadly, OSCON has gone away, but you can attend All Things Open. You can attend so many open source events out there, PyCon, etc. And you start then also talking to other OSPOs, other leaders, and that helps you kind of continue to evolve your open source practice inside your company. The last thing I'll say is the To-Do group, TODO group, is a huge source of information on how to start your OSPO and how to connect with other OSPOs in the industry. And you can find them at todogroup.org. They're a subgroup of the Linux Foundation.
To-Do group I've had a look at a lot of the work they've done, and it's fantastic. It is just so detailed, but also nothing strays from achieving just a certain result. Like you will learn a lot if you do check that out. So make sure that you do check that out. So you've set up an open source program office. It's running, it's working. How do you measure success? How do you go back and you say, okay, well, there's actually a positive ROI on what we're doing here?
And it's so important to connect it to the business success of the company and also to measure the ROI and to communicate that ROI. Sometimes it's the line of sight between open source consumption and the business impact on the company is a long line. So it's hard to say, because I use this, the revenue has grown so much or the cost is reduced so much, etc. So what we've been trying to do is, first, we try to measure the efficacy of the open source program office itself. Have we made a difference in the lives of our developers? Is it easier for them to consume open source, to contribute to open source, to engage with open source communities? And we measure the SLA or the time it takes for someone to submit a request and have it approved, for example. Mm-hmm. The second thing we do is we try to measure the health of communities we are involved in. Because we have dependencies on certain open source projects, we want to make sure that they are healthy and that we are working with healthy projects, but also helping those projects be healthy through contributions of money and etc.
And how do you measure the health? What is a healthy community? What do you look for?
I think there are some well-known metrics these days, thanks to projects like CHAOSS, CHOASS,
Yes. Again, a fantastic project.
the LF. And it's things, you could start with some very superficial things like the number of stars in the project, the number of forks, the number of downloads, the number of PRs, etc. But I think it's also the diversity of the community that's involved, not just diversity in terms of the different kinds of people involved, but also different companies that are involved or different communities that are involved, because you don't want one company to dominate or one organization to dominate a project, because when they withdraw, then the project can also die. It's how frequently do they release? Do they have a README document? Do they have a code of conduct? How easy is it to engage with the project from a communications perspective? How respectful are they of communications? Do they mentor new communicators or contributors? Do they make it easy for people to contribute to the project? To me, all of those things also matter, not just the velocity or the release of project innovation. We also measure such things as, if we open source something, how successful is that project? Is it being well maintained? And we, of course, check the health of that project as well. So I kind of tune in very much to CHAOSS and make sure that we look at the different things that they're advocating in terms of measurement of the company. We do have opportunities to kind of show business impact, from the sense that instead of using a commercial software, if you're using open source, you can kind of say, we've saved so many millions in license cost, right? So there's some amount of hard numbers you can show, but most of the time it is effectiveness numbers and health numbers that one can show.
That's great. And it was so amazing just to hear and go through that list, because I think measuring ROI, I remember when talking to Guy Martin, like, it's a difficult thing. There are just so many different factors. So thank you for laying those items out. I want to do something a little bit fun. And so kind of along the idea, if you could go and you could sit down with a younger yourself and say, before you set up a program office before, or you'd ever managed one, what are some of the key learnings that you'd sit down and you'd say to yourself back then?
I would say, what would I say to my younger self as I'm about to start an OSPO?
As you're about to start, yeah, based off the biggest things that you learned on your journey.
The biggest things I learned on my journey is, first of all, know the business of your company. What business is it in? What's important to the company? How do they measure their success? What do their customers want? Because that drives the role of open source and open source program office in that company. Every OSPO is different because it's supporting a different objective, a different mission, a different business case, a different product line. And so it's very important for us to understand how you are helping the company succeed and what is the company's business. So for instance, Comcast is a very practical company, very pragmatic company, very customer driven, very focused on innovation. And so it was important for me to understand the culture of the company and the business of the company. The second thing I would say is find enthusiastic people and find supporters. Don't first go to the detractors who don't believe in open source and try to convince them and argue till you're blue in the face. Go first to the supporters of open source and start building momentum, if you will. The third thing I would say is, if there are successes, shout it from the rooftop. Share it with others, communicate it, make heroes of the people who are successful, so that others then realize that they want to be heroes too, and they want to learn too, and they want to kind of do this stuff too. Last but not the least, I would say, is build a fantastic team around you. I am so lucky to have one of the best teams in the business. And we started off as a team of women, all women team. And then we said, no, no, we need diversity. So we brought our first man on the team. And we are a team who often did not come from an open source background, but we had the right bones. We believed in collaboration. We believed in customer service. We believed in innovation. And I am privileged to work with this team, and I'm very lucky to work with this team. So I would say those are some of the lessons. Work with, enthusiasts, understand the business of your company. Oh, one more thing, get a good champion or sponsor in your company.
Yes.
And this is so, so important. Someone at the top who believes in the importance of open source in your company and to its innovation. And I'm very, very lucky to have two of my best bosses ever, Matt Zalesko, who's our CTO, and John Moore, who's my boss, who's the chief software architect. They are incredibly pivotal to supporting and continuing open source work at Comcast.
That's great. And yeah, the champion is definitely necessary. I've heard that quite a few times now. So that is definitely a point that you need to remember. So I'd now like to shift gears a little bit and focus on best practices for managing corporate engagement with open source software. So what are some of the best practices that you've seen that companies have done when contributing back to open source projects they've used or consumed?
Yeah. I think you also said an important word, Henry, which is contribute. Many companies will start, and it's so easy to consume. So consumption is check, we've done it. Compliance a little harder, but they have to do it, so they'll do that, and then they'll stop. And it's important to give back. So it's important to contribute back. Why is it important to contribute back, and what do best-in-class companies do? First, they know their dependencies. They know what open source software they're using, and they know which is critical to their success. Mm-hmm. And then they go off and they start engaging with those communities. They either sit in on the mailing lists, they either sponsor that project, or they go attend at events, they evangelize their use of the project. And then beyond that, they start realizing that they've made some changes to the project and that these changes really belong back in the project. They don't want to carry technical debt. They don't want to fork the distribution and not benefit from the innovations of the project. They also realize that in order to use the latest security patches, they need to be on the head of the tree and not to fork and be on another side. So they do that, and they realize that if projects are not sustained in open source, the goose that laid the golden egg will be dead. And so sustaining open source, giving back open source is critical to all of us succeeding in open source, all of us consuming open source. So if each of us says, hey, someone else is going to do it, I'm not going to do it, then the commons will be gone. So we do need to contribute back.
How do you foresee the path towards achieving sustainability within the open source industry? What does that look like to you, and how do you think we can get there?
I think there are many, many players towards sustainability. There are players such as the foundations who aggregate, contributions and who give back to those communities. The Linux Foundation itself, for example, hosts hundreds of projects, and it provides a very professional level governance and infrastructure and monies towards that project, which comes in from members and it gets back into the community. And the philosophy of the Linux Foundation, which I love, is that projects start out in a very organic fashion, but then it gets used by companies. There's a commercial ecosystem that builds around it, and which then contributes money back through profits that they make and in the use of the product. So you really need that flywheel to be successful and to work, very effectively. So I would say foundations are extremely important. And then, of course, every consumer in the business contributing back in any way possible, not just code, but in money, in evangelization, marketing, volunteering, governance, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The third thing I would say is we are, really facing a lot of burnout of maintainers, of contributors. You cannot expect just one or two contributors to be bearing the burden of carrying the entire project. Our expectations of contributors and maintainers is high, so we need to make sure that we are grooming new contributors, grooming new maintainers to come into the business. We are supporting maintainers through, all taking on other help in the project that's needed, whether it's, marketing help, website or community development, etc. So I would think, sustaining the people in open source who are the commons, sustaining projects with everyone contributing, and then really help through foundations, helping create kind of a professionalism in projects are three big things. There's lots of steps, but I think these are three good ones.
Definitely, and I couldn't agree more. You touched on the point of the open source contributors and maintainers, and I know that a lot of maintainers and contributors these days are employed by companies like Amazon, by Comcast, and they're in very high demand. There's no doubt about that. So what does an open source friendly approach, how does an open source friendly approach attract great talent? Because I can imagine that there's a lot of developers that are working for Comcast and they love the idea that Comcast is an open source friendly company. So why is that?
Yes, having a great open source program office as well as an open source program as a company and being a good citizen in open source is very, very important to attracting and retaining good talent in the community. And you're exactly right. Many companies are, vying with each other for the same great talent. And the reason an open source culture inside the company becomes important is a lot of new developers, and frankly, a lot of mature developers today want to work with open source. They know that open source is everywhere. And they also like the philosophy of working with open source and the culture of open source and the belief of giving back. So they want that, and they don't want to work for a company that does not support that or does not give them enough time to work with open source or attend an open source conference or learn a new skill or to speak on behalf of the company and its innovation in open source. So I think knowing that there are mature practices in a company is a huge, huge draw for many, many of our developers. And it's a great sense of pride. It's a great sense of, I guess, happiness when you see your company represent itself in open source communities and be respected for the work that they do. So I think it's important to both recruiting and retention and development. So for example, on the development side, the contribution to open source, speaking at open source conferences is a key part of our technical ladder in the company. So if you want to go from being an engineer to a principal engineer to a distinguished engineer to a fellow, you need to have worked in open source and contribute to open source, which is huge. In the old days, it used to be that you would win patents, and getting patents is an important consideration. And I'm not taking anything away from that. We highly encourage our teams to also file for patents because patents and open source can coexist. But we also encourage them to give back and work in open source.
I think that's definitely also just a path towards sustainability, is having that encouragement from the company driving contributions and driving that kind of behavior is great to hear. And I've definitely heard it. It's consistent across a lot of people that I've talked to at the large companies. So again, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and focus on what some of the best practices are for managing open source communities for projects that, say, Comcast started or projects that a company starts. What are some best practices around that?
And that's so important, Henry, because you don't want to just release a project and then just disappear.
Yeah.
We're not in the business of dumping and running. We
Does that ever
want
work? Has that ever worked before? Do companies?
it works only if it is such a valuable piece of code that someone adopts it and then someone kind of takes it over and starts
Okay.
maintaining it, right? But then with millions and millions of projects these days, how does it even get heard, right? How do
Yes.
people even know? So right in the contribution process, when someone comes to us and says, I want to release this project, we immediately ask, do you have time to maintain this project once it's released?
Mm-hmm.
Have you and your manager allocated time for you to take care of that project? If you haven't, we will discourage you from releasing this project.
Yeah.
So that's important. We also ask the question of, is there an existing project that does similar things? Should this be contributed to that project or become a part of that ecosystem instead of starting yet another project, right? And so those are two really big questions we ask. And then once we approve the release of the project, my team gets involved and they help the developer successfully set up the project on GitHub, set up a README. We have a real checklist of things we feel is good hygiene: README, code of conduct, CLA, contributor guide, a logo, a sticker.
Logo. I found a lot of open source developers, they aren't the best designers at logos, but they always seem to love to do it themselves. And then the logo hangs around for years, even though it's got tens of millions of users, they've got a funky little logo that is just hand drawn.
Exactly. And my team is very creative. They kind of help with trademarking, logos, all of that good stuff. And they also coach them on community building, how you need to be transparent in your communications, how you need to share your roadmap, how you need to attract developers, how you need to nurture your developers by thanking them for their contribution, not biting their head off because they didn't do it right, and by encouraging, speaking at conferences about your project. So we help with a lot of the community building efforts, and we encourage these teams to do it. I'm so proud of some of our projects: traffic control, which is now at the Apache Foundation; Trickster, which is a Prometheus dashboard acceleration project, and it's being considered for more contribution to the CNCF Foundation, for example. Kuberhealthy, which is a Kubernetes cluster management software; Vinyl DNS, which is DNS as a service. So it's things that we do at scale. We are an at-scale company. We support millions and millions of customers. So it's really tested in our own work and in our own production. So when we put it out there, we try to make sure that it's supported correctly. I've got to be honest with you. Sometimes maintainers change, leave companies, etc. And so my team works very hard to kind of track down projects that are not very active and go back and talk to maintainers and make sure that they either assign it to somebody. So it's kind of a life cycle process for us. We help in the beginning and then we constantly monitor to make sure these projects are successful.
And you touched on a lot of the open source projects that Comcast manages. Why do you manage those open source projects? Why did you make them open source in the first place? Were they internal tools which you used and you thought the rest of the ecosystem could benefit from them? What was the reasoning behind really, I guess, having these open source projects?
And that's a great question. When teams come to us, we ask them why they're open sourcing it, because we want them to think about the reason. And sometimes the reason is, I find this extremely useful as a tool or a library inside the company. And we think there are many other companies which could benefit from this, or many other people who could benefit from this. So you're absolutely right. It's something that people feel so passionately that is going to be useful to the world. They want to make sure that they are contributing something back from a goodness perspective. The second reason teams will say is they want to demonstrate the innovation, the quality of work we do, because that attracts more developers into the company.
Mm-hmm.
When they see the kind of work we do as a company, in proprietary days, nobody knew what you did and couldn't even see your code. But now with open source, they can actually see your code. They said, dang, they do good work. And
That's
I want
cool.
to, be part of that. The third reason could be that you want to create a standard in a certain area because there is such a fragmentation of different ways to solve a problem. You want to create one way or a consistent way or a default standard in that area. And then, there are various other reasons. Building ecosystem, it makes it easier for you to help others consume your software and work towards a common API. And so, for all of those reasons and others, we often approve it. We approve almost 95% of the requests that come in front of us.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
incredible.
very rarely do we say no to, and this is our legal team incredibly supporting us, working with us, and making sure that, we give the developers the best guidelines for being successful in the open source.
Yeah, I know when I was talking with Gil Yehuda, he was saying that whenever the engineers heard something was going to be open source, they all kind of freaked out and they all thought, oh no, we better make this good. We better add good comments. We better make sure that the flow is right and it's structured right. And I was sort of thinking, why don't you just open source everything so you just give them this pressure? Or shouldn't technically the engineers be doing that the entire time? But I thought that was a very funny comment and observation on his behalf. But something else which I know you're very, very passionate about, and something which you've really, really been driving at as the chair and also on the board for the Linux Foundation for a while now, is the idea of diversity and inclusion. And we all know this is a very important issue across all industries today, but in particular in the open source space, it is something which we haven't necessarily, it's never really going to be solved, but I think it's something that we really needed to work towards. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how companies can work towards being more diverse and more inclusive, whether it's on their developer teams or within the open source projects they manage, or just in general.
Yes, indeed. It's a huge, huge passion for me, a huge part of what I do. When you have a role either as a chair or, heading your function inside the company, you have a platform and a privilege that you can use to voice the need for change and the need for policy and the need for a different way of doing things. And frankly, the reason open source has not been very diverse, in fact, the diversity in open source is much, much poorer than technology in general, is because open source was a bunch of enthusiasts and they kind of just really focused on innovating and moving the code forward. They never really thought about what they need to do from a culture and community perspective, right? So we are working very, very hard, and the Linux Foundation does a fantastic job of everything from scholarships to mentorships to inviting public speakers on the topic, and also showcasing all the diverse people in open source, because you cannot be what you don't see. So if you see someone on stage who looks like you see someone who's a leader in this space who looks like you, that inspires you, that tells you that that is possible, that's a path that can be possible for you. And so I'm very lucky to be part of an organization that really is driving it. But to your question, what else can companies do? What else can we do to improve diversity? And it's for various reasons, right? It's damn good for the business.
Mm-hmm.
It is really a world that we're building, a digital world that needs to reduce bias, remove bias from the build.
Mm-hmm.
It also creates incredible innovation. It creates opportunity and equity for people. So there's so many good reasons why diversity is important for me and for the world at large. Um, I would say companies can also make sure that the projects that they are involved in are diverse, are healthy, have a code of conduct. They can they can walk away from projects and say, I am not going to support you financially or otherwise if you do not have a diversity policy or mentorship. And I know it's hard for small projects to kind of invest in all that, but they can bring advice and counsel to that project. I would say do mentorship projects, support mentorship projects like Outreachy, like Google Summer of Code, like Linux Foundation diversity projects and mentorship projects. Not recognize just code, but recognize all diverse forms of contribution. Henry, you make a contribution in the form of marketing and evangelization. I make contribution in the form of marketing and governance and so on and so forth. So we need to recognize that open source needs all forms of contribution. I would say pay for scholarships for travel, for people to go attend events, do talks, do articles, one of the biggest things is walk away from conferences that do not seem to have a diverse set of speakers. Do not sit on open source panels that are all male panels or have no diversity. So there's lots and lots of different ways you can be an activist, you can be an active ally, if you will, of diversity in open source.
I couldn't agree more. And just on the point of recognizing all contribution is something that we've been very, very passionate about at Open Teams. And it was actually probably the first, I guess, aspect of our business that we focused on. So if you go to openteams.com today, you can create a profile and you can build out your profile with your skills, your experience. You can add an open source project you created, or you can go to an open source project that you've contributed to, and you can add your contribution, not just code, but any contribution. And I think that's really, really important, is there hasn't really been a way for people to be recognized, because I might be getting this number wrong, but I do remember hearing that over 70% of all the work isn't code. Only 30% of all the open source work done for open source projects in the open source industry is code. So I thought that was really interesting. But as we get towards the end, I thought this is something I always like to ask every guest. What are you most excited about with regards to the future of open source?
I think the future is extremely bright. I think it is here to stay. It is everywhere. One of the things that excites me is a broader adoption of open source in government, in the energy industry, in healthcare. There's been tremendous innovation during the COVID days, during this pandemic, of groups coming together to create projects that collect data or that help with contact tracing, etc. So we were involved, for example, in a project with the Code for Philly group in Philadelphia, which was working on how to track data for hospitals, and so that hospitals can do a better job of planning staffing and PPE, etc. So I love the broad adoption of open source. The second is, I think we are becoming more and more diverse and inclusive. And there is a vocabulary and a recognition of being diverse and inclusive, which I love. The third trend I'm a huge fan of is open source inside the company, or inner source. And for all of us to use those same principles, especially in a time like now, Henry, where all of us are working remotely. And open source has cracked the code on working across the world in an asynchronous way, across companies, across people, breaking down silos. And the same principles can easily be applied inside companies. So those would be the three things I would be very excited about.
That's great. And it is such an exciting future. And I think we're just at the beginning of what is a revolution in the software industry and just the world at large. So it's so excited to be a part of that. And you have been one of the leaders of that. So I do thank you so much for joining us today, and for all of the work you've put in to helping open source thrive, because that's really what we want to do at Open Teams. That's our mission, is to help open source help open source thrive. And I know that's something you've been passionate about for a long time. So thanks for joining us, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Henry. Thank you for such a thoughtful interview. I got a chance to share some of my passions and my excitement, and it couldn't have gone better. Thank you.
And I've loved chatting with you, so thanks. And everyone who's listening, if you liked what you listened to or watched today, then please go to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe and leave a comment letting us know what you think. And also one thing that really, really will help out is if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever medium or platform you're listening to this on. So I just want to thank you all for listening. Thank you, Nithya. Everyone stay safe. And until next time, goodbye.